You can find models that can be deployed as private API endpoints on SageMaker using the Johnson Labs website. Today, I am going to deploy our medical LLM model to SageMaker as a private API endpoint. This model, medical LLM, excels in answering complex clinical questions as well as summarizing clinical reports into digestible summaries. To start the deployment process, click on the Deploy to SageMaker button available on the model page. This will open up the SageMaker marketplace listing for the model. There is some helpful information about the model on the listing page. On the usage section, you can find the input format the endpoint expects, as well as the output format the endpoint returns. Next, click on the Continue to Subscribe button and accept the offer. Once you are subscribed to the product, click on the Continue to Configuration button. To launch an endpoint, SageMaker offers either CloudFormation or SageMaker Console or using AWS CLI to deploy your endpoints. We will be using the SageMaker Console to create a real-time inference endpoint. Click on the View Amazon SageMaker button to start creating your endpoint. Next, you will need to follow some steps. The first step is to create a deployable model from the model package that we just subscribed to. To do this, just provide a model name and use an IAM role that has Amazon SageMaker full access policy. Now click on the next button to start the second step. The second step is to create a private API endpoint from our model. Here you will need to provide a name for the endpoint and also create a configuration for the endpoint. You can configure the instance type that you want to use as well as the number of instances. Once you are happy with your endpoint configuration, click on the Create Endpoint Configuration button to save it. Now click on the Submit button. This creates the endpoint and it takes few minutes for the service to start. Once the endpoint is active, you can make requests to it either using AWS CLI or using AWS SDKs. Here, I am going to use a Google Colab notebook and install the Boto3 package, which is the Python AWS SDK. Next, I am creating a SageMaker runtime client using my temporary AWS credentials. To make requests to the endpoint, we need to call the invoke endpoint method on the SageMaker runtime client. This endpoint takes endpoint name as the first parameter, followed by the input that you send and the required content type and MIME types. We will use the endpoint name that we just created. Let's look at the question answering capability of this medical LLM endpoint. As you can see, I have prepared a JSON data where we use our built-in prompt template, the OpenBook QA. I also provide a medical context about the patient, and I'm asking a question: what symptoms did the patient experience after the injury? Now I call the endpoint using the query endpoint function, which internally calls the invoke endpoint. As you can see, the response returned by the endpoint is pretty concise. So its response is based on the provided context. The patient experienced sharp pain in his lower back soon after the injury, which then radiated down to his right buttock, all the way down to the lateral part of his leg crossing his knee. So the endpoint has taken the medical context as a reference point to answer the question, which is what we want. We can also send a custom prompt as part of the input text. As you see in this example, I have instructed the LLM endpoint to answer the following questions so a 5-year-old child can also understand. And the response we are getting is following the prompt. As you see from the response, it's saying, so you know how sometimes we get really mad or excited or our hearts beat fast? Well, high blood pressure is when your heart beats too fast all the time. It's like having a super fast heartbeat that doesn't stop. And this lady has been having it for 15 whole years. That's a lot of time. CDs helps to make sure her heart isn't working too hard. Yeah, so it's answering the question in a simplistic way, like I asked, so that a 5-year-old child can understand. Next, let's look at the summarization capabilities of the LLM endpoint. There is a predefined template called summarization that you can send as a parameter to the LLM endpoint to summarize your clinical documents. Next, I want to summarize this medical article on COVID and its effect on older adults on Brazil. So I'm going to send this entire text to the endpoint to see how the medical LLM summarizes this text. So as you can see, it has summarized the text. It's saying that the document discusses the clinical characteristics of older adults infected with COVID-19 in Brazil. It also says that the study analyzed 1,544 confirmed cases of COVID-19, and the overall study suggests that the certain demographic and clinical characteristics are associated with increased risk of death from COVID-19 in older adults, including age, sex, and various health conditions. So yeah, it's able to summarize the text. We can also send an array of text to the LLM endpoint. As you see, I'm sending here an input text that contains an array of COVID-19 articles. And when I send it to the LLM endpoint for summarization, it's able to properly summarize both the text. Similar to the Q&A, you can also send custom prompts for summarization. Here I am sending the request to the LLM endpoint to summarize this medical text in less than 30 words. And as you can see from the result, the response for the same document is now much more concise and less than 30 words. So this is how real-time inference API endpoints work for this model on AWS SageMaker. The real-time inference is useful when you have a few input data and the responses need to be quick. AWS automatically tracks the usage of your endpoints and bills you accordingly. So when you are done using your endpoint, it might be wise to stop it. To do so, find your endpoints page on AWS SageMaker. From there, you can delete your endpoint. Thank you.